Governmental systems expand through a structured process in which politicians introduce and pass legislation that establishes new agencies and offices. These statutes frequently employ broad and imprecise language to address issues framed as urgent or progressive, thereby securing electoral support and satisfying concentrated interest groups. Once enacted, the laws delegate substantial authority to the newly formed entities, enabling them to interpret and implement mandates in ways that extend beyond the initial stated purposes. This foundational step transforms political incentives into institutional realities, where the creation of an agency serves as the vehicle for ongoing public resource allocation. The cycle continues as the agencies receive dedicated funding through appropriations or budgetary processes and begin operations within allocated physical and administrative spaces. Staff positions emerge to support the mandated functions, and the entities quickly establish routines that solidify their presence within the governmental structure. Over time, these offices pursue expanded activities justified by reinterpretations of the original statutes, generating reports and metrics that demonstrate continued necessity even when underlying problems remain unresolved or diminish in scope. The pattern results in layers of bureaucracy that consume resources while producing outputs oriented toward self-maintenance rather than resolution. Analysis of this dynamic reveals interconnected mechanisms operating at federal, state, and local levels, including the establishment of interdependent networks and the development of specialized career pathways. These elements insulate the system from external pressures and perpetuate growth through internal coordination requirements. Examination of the processes of creation, normalization, expansion, and interdependence illuminates the incentives that drive bureaucratic enlargement. Strategies for restraint and reversal focus on legislative tools that directly address authorization and funding, thereby enabling systematic dismantlement of non-essential structures. The legislative foundations of bureaucratic creation. Legislation forms the legal basis for new government offices and agencies at every level of governance. At the federal level, members of Congress introduce bills that declare a problem and establish an entity charged with addressing it through rulemaking and operational authority. The bills proceed through committee review, debate, and votes in both chambers before receiving executive approval, at which point they become statutes that grant the agency its existence and mandate. State legislatures follow analogous procedures with bills that amend state codes, while local city councils enact ordinances that define the purpose and responsibilities of new municipal offices. Funding authorization occurs through separate or integrated budgetary measures that allocate resources from general revenues, taxes, or fees. Federal appropriations bills provide the necessary Treasury disbursements for startup costs and ongoing operations, subject to annual review. State budgets mirror this approach with legislative approval of expenditures, and city councils incorporate the new office into municipal fiscal plans drawn from property taxes, sales taxes, or grants. These funds enable the procurement of facilities and equipment without which the agency cannot function, establishing a direct link between legislative action and institutional activation. The vagueness inherent in many authorizing statutes facilitates subsequent expansion by allowing administrators broad discretion in defining activities. Politicians craft such language to accommodate diverse stakeholder demands and to project responsiveness to public concerns, yet the result delegates policy detail to the bureaucracy itself. This delegation creates agencies that operate under statutory cover while pursuing objectives that align with the interests of their creators and affiliated networks. The process repeats across jurisdictions, producing a cumulative increase in governmental entities that claim fidelity to original laws while adapting them to evolving internal priorities. The establishment and operationalization of new offices. New government offices commence operations once funding and legal authorization align. Administrators and initial staff occupy assigned or leased spaces procured through standard governmental channels, with furniture and equipment acquired via approved purchasing procedures. At the federal level, allocation occurs through centralized property management services that assign workspace and facilitate bulk acquisitions. State and local entities utilize internal facilities departments or competitive bidding for comparable needs, ensuring rapid setup within existing budgetary constraints. These logistical steps transform an abstract statutory provision into a functional organizational unit. Staffing begins with the appointment of leadership, often by executive officials, followed by recruitment under civil service or equivalent hiring protocols. Positions receive definitions tied to the authorizing measure, and early employees may include transfers from related departments to accelerate ramp-up. On the first operational days, the team reviews the statute to delineate permissible actions and drafts internal procedures and plans. Authority derives exclusively from the enabling legislation, which supplies the framework for rulemaking, grant administration, and program implementation without requiring further legislative intervention for routine matters. Initial activities focus on interpreting the mandate and initiating basic functions such as stakeholder consultations, data collection, and preliminary program design. The office generates reports that document progress and identify additional requirements, thereby establishing a record of activity that supports future budget requests. This phase solidifies the entity's role within the governmental apparatus, where it begins to interact with existing departments and external partners. The transition from conceptual creation to operational reality embeds the office in daily administrative practice and prepares the ground for sustained institutional development. Normalization, persistence, and mission creep. Agencies achieve normalization within a few years as routines, organizational charts, and performance metrics become standardized. Turnover occurs naturally, yet the accumulated procedures and relationships render the office an accepted component of the governmental structure. Annual budget submissions emphasize ongoing needs and emerging challenges, securing continued appropriations even when original issues show improvement or resolution. The process renders the entity seemingly indispensable, with justifications framed around the need for coordination and comprehensive coverage of related concerns. Persistence arises from the self-perpetuating character of funded institutions that expand their scope through reinterpretation of statutory language. Mission creep manifests as the agency incorporates adjacent policy areas under the umbrella of the original mandate, producing new programs and sub-initiatives that require additional resources. Funding continues uninterrupted because concentrated beneficiaries defend the office while costs remain distributed across the broader tax base. The absence of automatic termination mechanisms allows this growth to compound without reference to measurable outcomes tied to problem resolution. Mission transformation occurs gradually as administrators leverage vague provisions to address novel issues that align with internal or networked priorities. Reports and metrics highlight gaps that necessitate further activity, thereby converting the agency into a platform for ongoing policy advocacy and resource acquisition. This dynamic operates uniformly across federal, state, and local contexts, where the initial political impetus yields to bureaucratic imperatives that prioritize institutional survival and enlargement over the original legislative intent. Empire building, interdependence, and career mobility. Bureaucratic empire building unfolds when an established office generates requirements for supplementary entities to fulfill coordination, advisory, or specialized functions. The original agency proposes interdepartmental committees, task forces, or new sub-offices that depend on its data, oversight, or administrative support for effective operation. This interdependence insulates the originating entity because elimination of any single component disrupts the larger network, thereby reinforcing the perceived necessity of the full apparatus. Networks extend to partnerships with external organizations that receive funding or guidance, creating feedback loops that sustain expansion. The resulting structure forms an expanding lattice of offices whose functions interconnect through reporting requirements, joint planning, and shared resource allocation. Each additional layer adds meetings, compliance activities, and budgetary lines that justify further growth. The system rewards administrators who cultivate these relationships because larger domains confer greater influence and discretionary authority. Vague statutory foundations provide the flexibility needed to justify such proliferation without new legislation. Personnel dynamics reinforce the framework through the emergence of portable roles defined by process-oriented titles associated with coordination, outreach, metrics, and stakeholder engagement. Individuals move between offices, agencies, cities, states, and governmental levels using transferable credentials rooted in the same bureaucratic functions. These career pathways sustain the system by populating new entities with experienced staff who replicate established practices and advocate for continued funding. The mobility ensures that expertise remains internal to the governmental ecosystem rather than subject to external market evaluation. Strategies for restraining expansion and dismantling entrenched bureaucracy. Legislative bodies possess the authority to restrain bureaucratic growth through mandatory sunset provisions incorporated into authorizing statutes. Each new and existing measure includes a fixed expiration date after which the agency or office ceases unless affirmatively reauthorized following comprehensive review. This mechanism compels periodic justification of continued existence and compels evaluation against original purposes and performance standards. Reauthorization requires explicit legislative approval tied to demonstrated value, thereby shifting the default from persistence to termination. Zero-based budgeting imposes a requirement that every office justify its full allocation from first principles during annual fiscal cycles rather than requesting incremental increases. Appropriations committees and city councils examine each line item against current needs and outcomes, eliminating funding for activities that fail to demonstrate necessity. Narrow statutory language in future legislation limits interpretive discretion and confines agencies to precisely defined functions, reducing the scope for mission creep. Defunding serves as the direct instrument for immediate reduction, as legislatures control budgetary approval and can zero out specific offices without repealing underlying statutes. Dismantlement proceeds through sustained legislative majorities that repeal or amend enabling laws, consolidate overlapping functions into leaner structures, and transfer essential services where they exist. New administrations can initiate pauses through executive measures such as hiring freezes or program suspensions, yet lasting reversal demands legislative action to alter statutory foundations and budgetary practices. The process requires voter engagement that prioritizes scrutiny of vague proposals and support for representatives committed to structural restraint. These parameters establish clear pathways for rollback by realigning incentives toward efficiency and accountability rather than perpetual institutional growth. Conclusion: government bureaucracy expands and entrenches itself. The self-reinforcing mechanisms of bureaucratic expansion operate through legislative authorization, operational normalization, mission transformation, and interdependent networks that collectively insulate governmental offices from accountability. The patterns described produce layers of entities that consume public resources while advancing internal priorities disconnected from original problem resolution. Career structures further embed the system by creating portable roles that span jurisdictions and sustain the cycle across successive administrations. Restraint and dismantlement rest on the application of targeted legislative instruments that enforce expiration, demand fresh justification, and restrict funding streams. Sunset clauses combined with zero-based budgeting and precise statutory drafting provide the operational means to reverse entrenchment. Legislative bodies exercise these powers directly through appropriations and reauthorization processes, thereby restoring alignment between governmental structures and public purposes. Systematic application of these strategies across federal, state, and local levels dismantles non-essential offices and prevents the recurrence of empire-building dynamics. The result restores governmental efficiency by eliminating self-perpetuating networks and redirecting resources toward core functions. Such reforms demonstrate that bureaucratic growth stems from identifiable institutional processes and remains subject to deliberate correction through established channels of legislative authority.